Chapter 1. The Shadows of a Silent Love. A dry breeze swept the dust from the cobbled streets of the small town of San Felice that late afternoon, a place seemingly asleep in time. The faded facades of old houses stood like mute witnesses to secrets buried beneath decades of tradition and imposed silences. In the central square, the church bell rang 6 times, its echo rippling through the walls of the old mansion that housed Pedro's family grocery store. Pedro spent most afternoons there, behind a worn wooden counter, organizing rice and coffee bags, occasionally peeking through a dusty window that faced the street. He was a man of quiet presence, with a beard and dark, slightly disheveled hair, deep eyes that always seemed lost in distant thoughts, and a slightly plump build. Not quite enough to be considered overweight, but just enough to draw the judgmental glances and veiled jokes of the town's young men. On that particular afternoon, a new customer walked through the squeaky door. Pedro looked up with his usual disinterest, until he saw him. The man was tall, with tanned skin and striking, almost foreign features. His face held a stillness that felt both composed and distant. His hair was nearly shaved, and his intense eyes carried a history much heavier than that small town could ever permit. His name, Pedro would learn later, was Ramon. Ramon spoke little, his voice low and deliberate, with a soft accent Pedro couldn't quite place but found undeniably captivating. He bought only a pack of tobacco and some matches. When Pedro handed him the change, their hands briefly touched. A jolt ran through Pedro's arm, not of fear, but of something far more dangerous: desire. The town of San Felice was merciless to those who deviated from its norms. It was a place where every step was watched, every gesture whispered about on church pews and public benches. Men shook hands with force, women wore dresses down to their ankles, and the priest climbed the pulpit every Sunday to denounce what he called modern perversions. In this town, there was no room for difference, and any spark of individuality was quickly smothered by the weight of the collective. Still, Ramon kept returning. Always around the same time, just before sunset, when golden light flooded the store's shelves. He brought old books, sometimes dusty newspapers, which he left on the counter like excuses to linger. Pedro, in turn, began to look forward to those visits with a silent anxiety. He started grooming more carefully before work, choosing his least wrinkled shirt, tying his apron just a bit tighter. Between these brief encounters, something began to grow. A glance that lingered a second too long. A smile that escaped when it shouldn't have. Pedro, long used to hiding, even from himself, began to question whether what he felt was real or just the byproduct of his chronic loneliness. Ramon, though outwardly composed, carried invisible scars. His childhood had been marked by violence and a mother who, though loving, never dared to protect him. San Felice was just another stop in his wandering life. But here, he had found a reason to stay: Pedro. Ramon's room at the boarding house run by Dona Gilda was modest, its peeling walls and crooked window overlooking a side alley near the church. Dona Gilda, a bony woman in her 70s with sharp eyes, never asked questions but saw more than she let on. Ramon helped her with chores, sweeping the yard, fixing chairs, carrying firewood. Though raised in the same rigid culture as everyone else, Gilda had something in common with both boys. She knew what it was to live on the fringes. One night, after Pedro closed the grocery store, Ramon appeared for the last time that week. He carried a small black notebook and a wildflower. He said nothing, just handed Pedro the 2 items and walked away. Pedro stood still, holding them as if they were explosives. Later that night, in his bedroom, he opened the notebook. Page after page was filled with poetry, verses about longing, abandonment, and a body desired but never touched. Pedro hadn't cried since he was 12. But that night, sitting on the floor with trembling hands and a clenched chest, the tears came. Not from sadness, but from recognition. Someone else understood his pain. The town's silence made everything heavier. Their love could not be spoken aloud, not even whispered. It had to exist in glances, in small gestures, in coded words buried inside poems. And yet, within this hidden connection, there was something incredibly liberating. A spark. A silent promise. The following week, Pedro made a decision. Late at night, he took a detour from his usual route home and walked to the boarding house. He knocked gently on the back door. Ramon was already there, sitting in the dark kitchen, as if he had known Pedro would come. Outside, the town slept in silence. But inside that old house, their hearts beat too loud to ignore. It was the beginning of something that wasn't allowed to exist. But it was already too late to turn back. As Pedro and Ramon grow closer in secret, an unexpected gaze watches them from behind the church curtains. What was meant to remain invisible may soon be exposed. Chapter 2. The Gaze That Sees All. Inside the confessional, the scent of incense still clung to the dark wooden walls, heavy with decades of whispered sins. The heat of the late afternoon hung in the air, thick and unmoving. A rusty ceiling fan turned slowly above the heads of the faithful, making more noise than breeze. Father Anibol, stern-faced and always alert, listened to another nameless confession, but his thoughts wandered. Something had been bothering him lately, a persistent sense of disorder. A subtle but gnawing deviation from the expected rhythm of his town. He remembered the words of one of the parish's most devout followers, spoken timidly the previous week. Someone had seen two young men, one of them the grocer's son, walking together late at night near Dona Gilda's boarding house. There had been whispers of two close glances, of a certain proximity between them. The priest hadn't reacted then, but he had stored the information carefully, like a seed of warning waiting for the right moment to bloom. That same evening, Pedro walked quickly through the cobblestone alleys, his heart pounding in his chest. Though the sun had barely set, the sky already shimmered with violet and gold, the final breath of daylight. He avoided the central square, choosing narrow back routes. Dona Gilda's boarding house felt farther than ever, and the anxiety in his chest made every step heavier. Ramon waited for him at the back door, leaning against the frame, his face partially lit by the dim kitchen light. The silence between them spoke volumes. Pedro entered. No words, no gifts or poems, only the urgent need to be together. They didn't touch like lovers, but like survivors of a war only they understood. From the veranda, Dona Gilda watched them quietly while pretending to mend an old blanket. Her tired eyes saw more than she cared to admit. It was impossible not to notice what was growing between the two boys, and though her heart ached with compassion, fear had also begun to settle in. In San Felice, love like that could be a death sentence. Later that night, after Pedro had left, Gilda entered the kitchen and found Ramon sitting at the table, fingers locked together, head bowed. She hesitated, then softly told him to be careful. She said she had seen this before, long ago, when she was young and beautiful, and a local boy had nearly been beaten to death over similar rumors. She added that as much as she wanted to protect him, there were limits to what even compassion could shelter. Ramon didn't look up. He already knew. At that very moment, Pedro was walking the back path home, unknowingly passing behind the church. The lamplight cast long shadows across the walls. In the sacristy window above, a curtain moved ever so slightly. Father Anibol stood behind it, watching Pedro's silhouette vanish into the night. To the priest, this was not merely an issue of morality. It was a threat to the divine order he believed himself appointed to uphold. His mission, he thought, was not only to save souls but to guard tradition. Whatever was blossoming between those two boys was not love in his eyes. It was deviation, and deviation had to be corrected. The next day, Pedro sensed something had changed. When he arrived at the store, his father was unusually quiet, more sullen than usual. Customers watched him differently, some avoiding eye contact, others whispering in corners. It was like a fog had settled over the town, and he was its center. In the storage room, he found a folded envelope placed atop a stack of flour bags. Inside was a note, unsigned. What hides in the night will be revealed by the light of day. Guard your soul. His hands trembled. He felt it. Someone knew. Ramon didn't show up that afternoon. Pedro waited until the sun dipped below the rooftops, peering constantly out the dusty window. When night came and the streets emptied, he walked to the boarding house. Gilda answered the back door, her expression a mix of sorrow and fear. She told him Ramon had left that morning and hadn't returned. That perhaps, and her voice cracked, it was better that way. Pedro said nothing, just nodded and walked away, his chest tight and eyes stinging. The next morning, posters began appearing on the church walls and storefronts. A new sermon series was announced, titled, Against the Sins of the Flesh and the Enemies of Tradition. The sleepy town was waking up, and it wanted someone to burn. As the town turns against them, Pedro discovers a letter hidden in Ramon's poetry notebook, a plan to escape together. But is there still time? Chapter 3. A promise written on the edge of the world. The town of San Felice had never been quieter. Even the church bells seemed hesitant, as if time itself held its breath amid the tension weaving through the narrow alleys. In the town square, people walked quickly, eyes low, whispering in doorways and behind windows. Something had shifted, something invisible, but undeniably present. Pedro now walked with measured steps, his chest tight at every corner. He no longer felt safe, not even in his own home. His father, a stern man of few words, now looked at him with cold suspicion. Conversations at the dinner table had grown brief and brittle. His mother, silent and complicit in the family's rigid faith, filled the room only with murmured prayers. But Pedro could no longer return to what he once was. He had crossed a line within himself, and though fear pressed heavily on him, something deeper resisted being extinguished. Elsewhere in town, Ramon reappeared at dusk, slipping quietly through the back door of Dona Gilda's boarding house. She, having kept quiet vigil for days, simply sighed upon seeing him. He carried a worn backpack and a strange light in his eyes, urgency and something close to resolve. He climbed the stairs without a word, locked his door, and spread a collection of papers across the bed. Sketches, notes, a roughly drawn map. Among them, an unfinished letter written in bold blue ink, its corners smudged from anxious hands. It was a letter to Pedro. In it, Ramon explained why he had vanished. He wrote that a street acquaintance had warned him the priest was looking for them. That Pedro had been described by name. That their habits, the store, their night walks, all of it was now being watched. Ramon feared not just for himself, but for Pedro, still tethered to a family and a name that carried weight. The only solution, he believed, was to flee. But he had a plan. Ramon described an old, abandoned railway line, winding through the dense forest beyond the town's last dirt road. It had once been used to haul timber and goods. Now, rusting cars sat forgotten among trees and vines. Near a curve in the track, he would wait for Pedro, 3 nights from now. He marked the location, the date, and left only one sentence. "If you love me, come." He placed the letter carefully inside the black poetry notebook and tucked it among the old, dusty shelves at the back of the store, where he knew Pedro often lingered when alone. It was a risk, but he had no other way. That same night, he disappeared again. 2 days passed. It was on a rainy afternoon, while organizing supplies in the rear of the store, that Pedro found the notebook. It slipped from the shelf as if nudged by invisible hands. Flipping through its familiar pages, he found the envelope inside. His name was written on it. His heart stuttered. Reading Ramon's words, something inside him broke, and something else ignited. Tears fell freely, dampening the letter's corners. But there was something new behind his tears. Hope. And a problem. Pedro knew he was being watched. That was no longer a suspicion, it was fact. A neighbor who once greeted him now crossed the street when passing by. The milk delivery boy avoided eye contact. A few nights ago, behind the church, he had overheard his own name, followed by the word sin. He couldn't leave openly. He needed help. So he turned to the only person he still trusted, Dona Gilda. The next morning, under the guise of an errand, Pedro walked across town and knocked on her door. She welcomed him with tired but knowing eyes. In the kitchen, far from any window, he showed her the letter. Told her everything. She listened in silence. Then she gripped his hand and spoke softly. She said she didn't know if she could help them flee, but she owed love, at least the chance. She confessed that once, in her youth, she had loved a married man. That fear had kept her silent, and she lost him. She would not let silence win again. On the night Ramon had marked, Pedro prepared carefully. He hid clothing and supplies in a small bag behind the store. He told his parents he needed to stay late for inventory. Gilda had arranged for an old bicycle to be left behind her boarding house, near the trail. But before the sun could fully set, something changed. Two men appeared at the grocery store, one wearing the church's council cross, the other a local policeman and childhood friend of Pedro's father. They said they only wanted to talk. Asked vague but pointed questions. Mentioned rumors, conduct, concern for his soul. Their words were soft, but the venom dripped between each syllable. After they left, Pedro knew time had run out. That night, under cover of darkness, he left a note for his mother, not explaining, just thanking, and slipped out through the back door. He ran to Gilda's house, grabbed the bicycle, and rode the narrow forest paths toward the railway. The woods seemed to swallow the world. The sounds of insects mixed with the creaking of his pedals. The night was moonless. When he reached the clearing, he saw a small campfire glowing. And beside it, Ramon. Eyes wide with relief. They said nothing. They simply embraced, tightly, desperately, as though the world still conspired to separate them. But in that clearing, for a brief moment, there was only peace. The future was unknown. But the love, at last, no longer had to hide. As they follow the railway into the forest, Pedro and Ramon realize they are not alone. Someone has followed them into the night. Chapter 4: Echoes between rails and trees. The wind between the trees whispered warnings in a forgotten language. Around the clearing, the tall grass shifted gently, as if the forest itself was alive, silently watching the two young fugitives. The campfire crackled softly, and beside it, Pedro and Ramon still hadn't spoken. Words weren't necessary. The reunion, after so much silence and fear, said everything. They sat on a worn blanket, sharing pieces of bread and sips of water Pedro had brought. Their eyes met often, confirming over and over that they were really there. But time was no friend. They had to leave before daylight, before the town awoke and resumed its watch. At the first sign of morning light, they extinguished the fire with soil and scattered its remains. They walked the overgrown tracks of the abandoned railway, where rusted rails were slowly being swallowed by moss and roots. The deeper into the forest they went, the heavier the isolation felt. The track once curved toward an old tunnel and continued all the way to the border of a neighboring town, a place where no one knew their names. Each step was deliberate but firm. Pedro carried the small backpack, while Ramon kept a folding knife tucked discreetly at his waist. The forest was quiet, save for the crunch of their footsteps on gravel and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by morning birds. Late in the afternoon, they stopped near a derailed train car to rest. That's when Pedro noticed something strange. Footprints, not theirs. 3 sets, not 2. Fresh. He froze. Calling Ramon with a silent gesture, they crouched beside the prints. The tension between them thickened. There was no denying it. Someone was following them. Time stood still. Ramon climbed the rusted car to get a better view. From above, through the trees, he saw a figure in the distance. Tall, male, wearing a dark coat. Still watching. Not armed, it seemed, but certainly not lost. As night fell quickly, they had no choice but to hide inside the train car. The wood was damp, the air heavy with rust and mildew. It was cramped, shadowy, but safe for now. Inside, with pounding hearts, Pedro whispered that maybe they should go back. That if the whole world was hunting them, perhaps escape was useless. But Ramon gripped his hand firmly. Not with cruelty, but conviction. They had come too far. 4 hours, they remained silent. The night outside hummed with insects and broken branches. At times, footsteps echoed nearby. Ramon kept the knife ready, and Pedro held his breath whenever the shadows moved. Just before dawn, the figure approached. The car door creaked. They braced for the worst. But it wasn't a priest, nor the police. It was Andre, one of the boys from the church. Slim, pale, with light eyes and a desperate look. Known to everyone as a shy altar boy, the baker's son. He held his hands up, trembling, breathless, unarmed. Pedro recognized him immediately. Shock froze him. Andre looked just as frightened. But his voice, when it came, was steady. He said he wasn't there to turn them in. That he had overheard them weeks ago, behind the sacristy. That he, too, had always felt something inside him that the town would never accept. He said that seeing Pedro and Ramon run had awakened something in him, not envy, but a sense of possibility. That he hadn't known where else to go. Silence hung between them. Then Ramon let him in. Suspicion remained, but Andre's eyes were truthful. He was scared, but he had hope. Pedro sat beside him. Slowly, the tension softened. Andre explained that the town now believed Pedro and Ramon were gone. That the priest had condemned them from the pulpit. That Pedro's father was under pressure to answer for his son. That it might only be a matter of days before organized search parties combed the surrounding woods. The news hit hard. Ramon suggested they accelerate the plan, follow the tracks until the next abandoned station, and from there head to the municipal border. Andre, despite his exhaustion, begged to go with them. Said he had no future back home. That his father had threatened to send him to a faraway seminary to correct his tendencies. Pedro hesitated. But in Andre's eyes, he saw his own past, his same isolation, his same silence. He understood. He nodded. And so they became three boys bound by a love they couldn't speak aloud, but one that pulsed too fiercely to abandon. At dawn, they continued their journey, footsteps echoing on the iron rails, unsure of what the next bend might bring. With Andre now among them, Pedro and Ramon must choose, split up to increase their chances, or stay together and face greater danger as one. Chapter 5. Decisions at the Edge of the Abyss. The morning dawned gray, as if the sky itself shared in the burden the three boys carried. Low clouds brushed the treetops, and from time to time, a cold drizzle fell over the abandoned tracks, giving the leaves and stones a dull, wet sheen. The scenery was beautiful, but heavy, the kind of beauty that aches. Inside the derailed train car where they had spent the night, Pedro, Ramon, and Andre sat in silence. The tension between them was almost physical. Though Pedro had welcomed Andre with a degree of empathy, Ramon still watched him with cautious eyes. He didn't doubt the boy's pain or his sincerity, but life had taught Ramon to always expect betrayal from the shadows. Andre looked worn out, pale, his light eyes ringed with exhaustion. He had walked all night to find them, and now he said he couldn't go back. His parents had threatened him with religious confinement, and the town was already awash with talk of sin, scandal, and purification. Pedro and Ramon were no longer nameless whispers. They were now spoken of in church, in shops, in streets. While eating the last of the bread and drinking lukewarm water, Ramon laid out a plan. He believed they should split up. Andre, he said, would take a narrow hunting trail that ran parallel to the tracks, leading to an old barn once used by travelers and workers. Pedro and Ramon would continue along the railway. If any danger arose, they would draw attention away. It was a risk, but it improved the chances that at least one of them would reach safety. Pedro didn't like the idea. He worried about Andre, thin, shaken, alone in the woods. But he also understood the logic. The world outside those trees wasn't made for people like them, and it was even crueler when they were together. Andre accepted without protest. His voice trembled, but not with fear, with a sense of resignation. Pedro sketched out a crude map on a piece of cloth, using charcoal from the fire. He marked 2 points, the barn and an old deactivated station further ahead, called Narrated Station. If anything went wrong, they were to reunite there. At dusk, they parted ways. Pedro and Ramon continued along the tracks, hearts beating fast, eyes always scanning the woods. Andre disappeared into the trees, following the barely visible trail. Before leaving, Pedro hugged him tightly, a gesture that said what words couldn't. Night came suddenly, cloaking everything in black. The forest changed character, darker, thicker. At one point, the tracks passed over a narrow wooden bridge, old and warped, stretching over a gorge with sharp rocks and a fast-moving stream below. The planks creaked with every step. Ramon walked ahead, testing each one. Pedro followed, holding his breath, afraid to look down. Halfway across, they heard it. Voices. Footsteps. Close. Pedro turned, nothing behind them, but movement in the trees on the far end of the bridge. He looked at Ramon, who had already drawn his knife. They ran. At the end of the bridge, they found cover behind overgrown bushes near a sharp curve. Moments later, 3 men emerged from the woods, lanterns in hand. One had a rifle slung across his back and a crucifix hanging from his neck, likely one of the church's enforcers, or worse, a self-appointed guardian of morality. The boys didn't breathe. The men crossed the bridge, inspecting the tracks, poking the wood with their weapons. They were looking for them. Pedro's heartbeat pounded in his ears. They remained hidden until the woods returned to silence. Then they moved. Quietly, cautiously. They left the tracks and cut through the brush, following Ramon's memory of old supply paths once used by lumbermen. They spent that night hidden beneath a fallen tree, their bodies sore, clothes soaked, the silence between them thicker than ever. The next afternoon, nearing the entrance to the Narrated tunnel, Pedro spotted something on the ground. It was the piece of cloth he had used for the map, mud-stained and partially folded. Next to it, small footprints. Lighter. Familiar. He knelt and picked it up, pressing it to his chest. Ramon knelt beside him. "He's been here," he murmured. The tunnel lay ahead. Dark. Silent. Waiting. Somewhere inside, maybe Andre was still walking. Maybe. As they enter the tunnel, Pedro and Ramon discover blood on the ground, and something Andre left behind. What was once a quiet escape now becomes a race against time. Chapter 6. In the dark, blood speaks too. The tunnel rose before them like the open mouth of a sleeping beast, wide and black, its breath cold and damp. Once built to let trains pass through the mountain, it now stood abandoned, forgotten, swallowed by time and moss. Inside, darkness reigned, broken only by the faint sound of dripping water and the rustling of hidden things. Pedro knelt at the entrance, holding the mud-stained map cloth in his hands. Next to it were footprints, smaller, lighter. His heart raced. Beside the prints, a torn piece of fabric. Burgundy in color, frayed at the edges, caught on a branch at ankle height. Pedro touched it gently. The cloth was sticky, darker in patches. He brought it to his nose. Blood. His breath hitched. Ramon came closer, his face tense. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Both of them knew something was wrong. Very wrong. They entered the tunnel. Ramon lit a small kerosene lantern improvised from an old can and cloth wick. The flickering flame cast twisted shadows on the stone walls. The damp air smelled of mold, rust, and rot. Water dripped steadily from cracks in the ceiling. The gravel beneath their feet crunched with each cautious step. The silence was unbearable. Every sound, a drop, a footstep, a distant echo, felt like a scream in the dark. They walked slowly, their nerves fraying with each meter. Pools of stagnant water gleamed dully. Rusted tools and fragments of rotted wood lay scattered along the edges of the old tracks. The walls curved slightly, distorting sound and sight. Then, Pedro stopped abruptly. On the ground, near the tunnel wall, lay a small, waterlogged notebook. He knelt and opened it. Inside, in a slanted, delicate script, were words he recognized, Andre's handwriting. Pages filled with short notes, thoughts scribbled in haste, some almost unreadable. One phrase stood out, legible despite the smudges. "If something happens to me, I want it known. I tried to run being who I am. Not for the world, for myself." Pedro pressed the notebook to his chest, tears rising. But there was no time to mourn. More signs appeared, droplets of dark red, leading deeper into the tunnel. They followed them. Eventually, they reached a service alcove, a stone recess built into the tunnel wall, where rail workers once waited for trains to pass. And there, curled against the wall, was Andre. His body was mud-covered, shivering. His left leg bore a long gash, blood clotted and soaked through his pants. His face was pale, lips dry, and his breath shallow. But he was alive. Pedro rushed to him, cradling his head. Andre stirred weakly, managing a cracked whisper. "They..." He couldn't finish. Ramon quickly assessed the wound. He said it wasn't fatal, but the blood loss was serious. Likely cut by metal or a sharp branch while fleeing. With strips of shirt and steady hands, Ramon wrapped the leg and applied pressure. Pedro held Andre tightly, warming him with his own body. He whispered to him softly, telling him to stay awake, to hold on. No one spoke of turning back. Not yet. They had made it this far. And now, they were together again. 3 boys, bruised and hunted, but breathing. Inside the cold belly of the mountain, surrounded by stone and shadows, they clung to life and to each other. The night passed slowly. Outside, no one knew what waited. At dawn, as they tried to carry Andre out of the tunnel, they realized they're surrounded. Their only chance is to run, but not all of them can escape. Chapter 7, Where Love Bleeds Too. The dawn came gray and heavy, like a blanket laid gently over the trees. The mist outside thickened at the tunnel's mouth, swallowing sound and light. Inside the alcove, the cold seeped through the stone walls, brushing the boy's skin with its damp fingers. But none of them spoke of the cold. There was only fear, and the knowledge that time was running out. Andre lay still, barely conscious, his breath shallow and uneven. Pedro sat with his back to the wall, holding him, rocking gently. Ramon stood at the entrance of the alcove, eyes fixed on the shadows dancing at the end of the tunnel, knife in hand, silent as stone. Then came the sound. At first, just a branch breaking. Then another. Murmurs. Footsteps. The metallic rattle of something being dragged. Pedro looked up. They were surrounded. Ramon turned quickly. No escape behind them, only darkness and a forest of stone. And ahead, the unmistakable signs of a search, torchlight flickering at the tunnel entrance, voices calling names, footsteps multiplied. They were being hunted, and their hunters were close. Pedro's gaze met Ramon's. The choice was clear. They had to run. But Andre could barely move. Ramon whispered, firm, urgent, that he and Pedro had to go. If they stayed, all 3 would be caught. If they carried Andre, they'd be too slow. He told Pedro it was time to make a choice. Pedro shook his head violently. He couldn't leave him. Not after everything. Then, in a voice that barely registered above a whisper, Andre spoke. He asked them to leave him. Said he couldn't go on. That he didn't want to be the reason they were captured. That, for the first time in his life, he had been seen, truly seen, and that was enough. His lips trembled. His eyes didn't plead. They simply understood. Pedro wept. But Ramon, heart-hardened by necessity, took Pedro's hand. They had to go. Andre pulled the small notebook from beneath his coat, the same one Pedro had clutched before, and gave it back. He told Pedro to let the words live, even if he didn't. That memory was a kind of survival too. Then he smiled, weak, broken, beautiful. Pedro and Ramon ran. Behind them, voices echoed through the tunnel. Boots scraped on gravel. A gunshot cracked like a whip. Then another. Pedro stumbled, wanted to turn back. Ramon pulled harder. There was no time. They burst out into daylight, onto a slope slick with mud and moss. The hill dropped steeply, the earth loose beneath their feet. They slid, fell, scrambled. Branches slashed their skin. Their breaths came in gasps. Behind them, shadows moved between trees. Another shot rang out. But they didn't stop. They ran until the forest swallowed everything. Until even their fear became part of the wind in the leaves. Finally, they collapsed in a hidden clearing, lungs burning, knees shaking. Pedro didn't cry. There were no tears left. He simply clutched the notebook to his chest and whispered Andre's name. Ramon sat beside him, bruised, breathing hard, staring into the treetops. He said, barely audible, that they would find a place. Somewhere to live, even if the world tried to erase them. That love like theirs didn't vanish, even when it bled, even when it had no name left to speak. Months later, in a distant town, Pedro and Ramon begin again. But the past leaves shadows, and only by honoring it can love fully survive. Chapter 8. The place where the sun also embraces. Months had passed since Pedro and Ramon ran down that muddy slope, leaving behind the tunnel, the gunshots, and the silent farewell of Andre. Their world had changed, and so had they. The town where they now lived was called Ventosa de Serra, nestled between hills and green valleys far from San Felice, more than 300 kilometers away. Mist lay gently over rooftops in the morning, and people kept to themselves. There were no priests shouting from pulpits. No inquisitive neighbors. No one who knew their names. Pedro and Ramon worked at a small local brickyard, shaping tiles and bricks with calloused hands and sore arms. It was hard labor, but it gave them something the past had stolen: quiet. They shared a modest room behind the brickyard, slowly turning it into a home. They hung simple curtains, stacked used books in a corner, and decorated the walls with old photographs and a Polaroid camera Pedro had found at a street market. They cooked together, spoke little, but the silence now had another tone, one of presence, not fear. And yet, some nights, Pedro woke up gasping. The dreams still came. Boots echoing in tunnels. Cries in the dark. Blood on stone. Other nights, Ramon sat on the bed's edge, staring into the distance, the lamplight trembling with the breeze, memories flickering behind his eyes. Andre's absence was never spoken of, but it lived in them. It showed in the notebook Pedro kept hidden under the mattress. In the moments when he read Andre's words before sleeping. In the empty chair they always left at the table, though no one ever sat there. Then came the rainy afternoon that changed everything. Pedro returned from the market to find a small poetry reading taking place in the town square. A modest gathering, a few people under a cloth canopy. A woman stood, reading poems aloud from anonymous authors. The tone was soft. Fine. Pedro stopped, hesitated, then slowly reached into his bag. He pulled out Andre's notebook, weathered, faded, sacred. Without saying a word, he handed it to the woman and asked, barely audible, if she could read a page at random. She opened it. And read. I ran for myself for so long that when I finally found me, it was too late. But someone saw me. And in that gaze, I was born again. A stillness fell over the group. After a moment, an old man said the poem felt raw, but true. Beautiful. Pedro smiled, softly. For the first time, Andre's words lived out loud. That night, Pedro told Ramon everything. Said perhaps it was time to let go of the fear, not to forget, but to honor. That Andre's story didn't deserve silence anymore. Ramon listened, tears in his eyes. Then, after a long pause, he spoke, not about pain, but love. Said he had never truly known what love was until Pedro. That if hiding was the cost, he would pay it. But maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to hide all of it anymore. They made a decision. The next Sunday, they climbed a hill behind town. On top stood a solitary tree, the wind soft and steady. There they dug a small hole beneath its roots and placed a wooden box inside. A box containing Andre's notebook, a scrap of their hand-drawn map, and a dried flower picked the night they had reunited by the fire. Not to bury the past, but to give it a resting place. Pedro whispered that it was a home for memory. A grave with no body, but with soul. With time, life grew quieter. They never declared themselves openly. The world wasn't ready. But they walked through the town together, shared coffee, laughed with neighbors, invented stories about their past that no one questioned. To others, they were just two hard-working men. But to themselves, they were everything. Their love wasn't made of grand gestures. It was made of mornings shared in silence, of hands brushing beneath the table, of glances that said, "I'm still here," and it was enough. Sometimes, Pedro still wrote, not from pain, but from gratitude. He knew he would never forget San Feliz, or the tunnel, or the boy who chose not to run. But he also knew that life still fit in his arms. And that love, the kind that bleeds, flees, survives, now breathed in sunlight.